So he did launch wars of conquest. What was his view of war and conquest, and what maybe what are the things we should mention in terms of expansionary wars?
He thought he was authorized by God to reconquer the lost provinces of the Western Roman Empire. And when he did so, that was proof that God favored him. And he was generally opportunistic about it, and for the most part kind of successful, in that he intervened in the most critical moments of the histories of these barbarian, kingdoms in the West, and exploited their weaknesses and took them over. Now, in the process, many of these provinces were ravaged by war. Italy for decades. He overstretched his resources, leaving his successors with a much more dangerous situation to defend. And he disbanded certain armies that were meant to protect Constantinople, sent them to Italy, for example. This weakened the home front. So he left a very difficult legacy for his successors in that way. Plus, some of the provinces that he conquered were so, like Italy, I don't think it could even pay for itself after a certain point. So I'm not sure that some of those decisions were the best ones. North Africa, yeah, probably that paid off. Italy and southern Spain, not so sure.
So that's one of the big criticisms is even though there was conquest, it was overextended and those lands were not economically stable.
Yeah, and
broke.
Yeah.
AKA.
Conquest is not just good, in itself. I mean, I know that some rulers in history are called the Great simply because they conquered something, but that's not enough. I mean, I know that rulers do this, but if we're to compare them to each other, we should at least expect that they have a plan or that it works out well in the end, let's say. And I don't think that many of these did.
I should say that as far as historians go, I think you don't give too many points on the conquest front.
Personally, I don't. No.
Yeah, so your value comes from, is a leader implementing lasting change, like a stable...
Was he good for his subjects?
Yeah.
Were they living better because of him than otherwise?
And also like longer, like the long-term nature of it, not just...
Yeah.
Not just like a temporary thing.
Right. Are you strengthening institutions that benefit your subjects? That. And some he did, some not. So look, in order to send those armies west to make those conquests, he stripped the east of armies. So the Persians could just march in and destroyed Antioch. That's a major strategic failure. And I don't think you get a pass for conquering North Africa by surrendering Syria.
He did rebuild Constantinople and reconstructed the Hagia Sophia.
Yes, after he and his soldiers set fire to it. Yes, in the Nika insurrection. So this is when the people of the capital rise up against him, and there's about 10 days of street fighting, and he brings in some armies, and eventually he orders his armies to slaughter the protesters, leaving more than 30,000 dead. This is an enormous number. And a lot of Constantinople burned in the process, and he rebuilt it. So his building is considered one of his great points. He built Hagia Sophia, for example, which is a magnificent church, hands down. It's just a fascinating monument to study too. And that was him too. I'm trying to give you a sense here that the good and the bad are mixed in such equal measure that, like Buridan's ass, I can't decide which bale of hay to put him on.
But there's a grand scale to the good and the bad.
Yes.
For many people, that's what makes for a top 10 emperor list. What about the plague?
Well, he wasn't responsible for that, at least. Okay.
The Plague of Justinian,
yes,
aka 541 AD. So some historians claim that it killed half the population and ruined the empire. You are skeptical on this view.
Yes. So this is a bubonic plague, which lasts more or less for 2 centuries. It comes and it goes, and it's kind of endemic to large parts of the world. 541 is when it starts to break out in the empire, in Constantinople and other cities, and it spreads. There's been a lot of debate about this recently, because now we've actually isolated the pathogen. It's Yersinia pestis, we know this. just like a generation ago, this was just guesswork.
Mm-hmm.
But now there's all of this new like laboratory science work that's come in to fill in some of the gaps in history.
That's so cool.
It is. There are lots of discussions about that. And so the study of diseases and virology have just become much more important lately. It still doesn't tell you, however, like mortality rates and historical impact. Like for that, you still need standard old-fashioned non-laboratory historical work.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a debate about the impact of this plague. It's ongoing, I should say that. And some scholars argue for a kind of maximalist position of 50%. I think that would have brought this society to a halt, just logistically speaking. And so I believe in a much more moderate impact.
And the real impact is what? The tax base shrinks?
Oh yeah. The tax base would shrink instantly. You wouldn't be able to recruit armies. There would be massive social dislocation. Like what happens in the Black Death in Europe in the 14th century. Like we have very good records for what happened to those societies, and basically everything that they were doing stopped for a few years until they sort of tried to put things back together again. This does not happen in the 6th century. In fact, Justinian is at that time waging war on something like 4 or 5 different fronts. If you read the narratives of those wars, there's no pause. There's no impact from the plague on the conduct of those wars. They just continue on.
Mm-hmm.
Taxation continues, the courts continue. Like you just don't see it in the narrative. And so I think that there's a much less impact than certainly than 50%, yeah.
So this sets the stage for tumultuous 7th century.
Yeah, you could call it that. Yes.
So what is the legacy of Justinian in terms of how he left the empire leading into the 7th century?
Well, he left it overextended. So his successors had to deal with many more problems along many more fronts, with fewer military forces concentrated in what we might call the homeland of the Eastern Roman Empire. And so that made the center vulnerable too. And so you start to get raids into the Balkans, and it enters a kind of vicious cycle again. Now, not all of this was Justinian's fault. I mean, the plague definitely had some impact, but I wouldn't blame everything on his successors, as is sometimes done. Like they mishandled the situation. He left them a very difficult situation to deal with.